The barometer was falling like a dead man. Lieutenant Commander Edward Marsh watched the needle drop and felt the old familiar dread settle into his bones. Somewhere beyond the gray horizon, 7 German submarines waited in a line 200 miles long. Somewhere closer, a storm was building that would turn the North Atlantic into a killing ground. February 1943 had already claimed more ships than any month before it. Tonight, Marsh knew, the sea would demand more. HMS Dogged pitched hard to starboard as a wave rolled beneath her hull. She was a V-class destroyer, built in the last war and showing her age. Her rivets wept rust. Her engines groaned at full speed. But she was fast and she was tough, and her crew had learned to love her the way sailors love difficult women. Marsh had commanded her for 11 months. In that time, they had sunk 2 U-boats and saved 3 convoys. Good numbers. Not good enough to forget his brother burning alive on a tanker off Iceland. The convoy stretched behind them across 5 miles of grey water. 42 merchant ships carrying fuel, food, ammunition, and hope. Each one was a target. Each one was a lifeline. Britain was starving. Britain was running out of everything. These slow, wallowing cargo ships were all that stood between survival and defeat. Chief Petty Officer Doyle appeared at Marsh's elbow with a cup of tea. He was 50 years old, with a face like weathered granite and hands scarred from a lifetime at sea. He had fought at Jutland in 1916. He had seen dreadnoughts die. Nothing surprised him anymore. Signal from Dogged, sir. Captain Whitmore orders all escorts to close formation. Storm warning. Marsh took the tea without looking. I read the weather report. Force 10 by midnight. Aye, sir. The merchantmen won't hold formation in that. No. They won't. The old argument played out in Marsh's mind. In a storm, convoys scattered. Ships ran before the wind, each captain fighting to keep his vessel alive. Escorts could do nothing but wait for the weather to pass and hope to gather the survivors. Standard procedure. Sensible procedure. And exactly what the German wolf packs were counting on. The U-boats would wait beneath the waves while the storm raged. When it passed, they would surface into a sea full of scattered, isolated targets. No escorts. No protection. Just cargo ships struggling to reform, easy prey for torpedoes in the night. Marsh had seen the aftermath. Oil slicks and floating wreckage. Bodies in life jackets, frozen solid. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones burned or drowned or simply drifted until the cold took them. His brother had drifted for 6 hours before he died. The rescue ship found him still clutching a piece of decking, his hands frozen to the wood. Sub-Lieutenant Peters climbed to the bridge, his young face pale. He was 22 and had been aboard for 3 weeks. Every wave made him flinch. Sir, wireless room reports BDU transmissions. Heavy traffic. They're coordinating something. BDU. Befehlshaber der Unterseeboot. U-boat command. Admiral Donitz himself, sitting in his headquarters in France, moving his grey wolves like chess pieces across the Atlantic. The Germans had broken enough codes to know roughly where the convoys sailed. The British had broken enough codes to know roughly where the U-boats waited. It was a war of information as much as weapons, and tonight both sides knew the other was coming. Marsh made his decision. Signal to Dogged and Dogged, he said quietly. I am proceeding ahead of convoy to sweep for submarines. Request volunteer escorts to accompany. Doyle's eyebrows rose slightly. That was all the reaction he allowed himself. Sir, Captain Whitmore's orders were to close formation. I'm aware of Captain Whitmore's orders. In this weather, sir, ahead of the convoy means into the storm. I know what it means. The silence stretched between them. Peters looked from one man to the other, not understanding. Doyle understood perfectly. He had served with mad captains before. He had never served with one this particular kind of mad. The men won't like it, Doyle said finally. The men will do their duty. Aye, sir. They will. The signal lamp began to flash. Across the gray water, Marsh watched the other destroyers receive his message. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, one by one, two of them broke formation. HMS Dogged and HMS Dogged. Their captains had served with Marsh before. They knew him. They trusted him. Or perhaps they were simply as tired of watching merchant sailors die as he was. Marsh finished his tea and handed the cup back to Doyle. Tell the engine room full speed. And have the galley prepare hot food for all hands. It may be the last they get for a while. The destroyer's bow swung north, directly into the building waves. Behind them, the convoy began to fade into the spray. Ahead, there was only darkness and wind and the enemy waiting in the deep. Marsh gripped the bridge rail and watched the first real waves begin to build. Somewhere out there, a German captain was watching the same storm approach. Somewhere out there, 42 ships full of food and fuel sailed toward death. Not tonight, Marsh thought. Not if I can help it. The hunt had begun. 40 feet below the surface, Captain Lieutenant Werner Hoffmann listened to his boat dying. U-447 groaned with every wave that passed overhead. Her pressure hull, designed to withstand the crushing depths, flexed and complained against forces it was never meant to endure. The storm above was tearing the ocean apart, and even at this depth, the submarine pitched and rolled like a drunk. Hoffmann was 36 years old and had been at sea since he was 16. He had served on surface ships before transferring to U-boats in 1940. 3 years of war beneath the waves had aged him 20. His hair had gone gray at the temples. His hands shook when he was alone. He had sunk 14 ships and killed perhaps 1,000 men, and every one of them visited him in his dreams. Herkelu, his first officer whispered, using the familiar shortened title. The men are suffering. Request permission to dive deeper, find calmer water. Hoffmann shook his head. Their orders from BDU were explicit. Maintain attack depth. Wait for the storm to pass. Strike the convoy when it scattered. Admiral Donitz had planned this operation personally. The wolf pack would feast tonight, but Donitz was sitting in a warm office in Lorient. He wasn't breathing air thick with diesel fumes and vomit. He wasn't listening to his crew retching in the darkness. He wasn't watching the depth gauge swing wildly as waves the size of buildings rolled overhead. The smell was the worst part. 52 men packed into a steel tube smaller than a suburban house. No showers. No fresh air. The heads backed up regularly. Men urinated into cans when the toilet was occupied. The food rotted quickly in the humidity. And beneath it all, the constant stink of diesel fuel that seeped into everything, into clothing and skin and lungs. Engine room reports water in the bilges, the first officer continued. Hull seals are leaking. Hoffmann nodded. Type VIC submarines were workhorses, reliable and deadly, but they were not meant for this. The British convoys usually scattered in storms, and the U-boats simply waited in comfort below the thermocline where the water was calm. But this storm was different. This storm reached down into the deep. Above them, unknown to Hoffmann, 3 British destroyers were doing something impossible. They were sailing directly into the storm's heart, hunting. No rational captain would attempt it. The seas were running 40 feet. The wind was gusting to 70 knots. Visibility was measured in yards. Any ship caught beam on to those waves would roll over and sink in seconds, but Lieutenant Commander Marsh was not rational. He was driven by something darker and colder than reason. Aboard HMS Dogged, the world had become a nightmare of water and wind. The bow buried itself in every third wave, and the ship staggered like a boxer taking punishment. Men moved through the passages with ropes tied around their waists. 2 sailors had already been swept overboard, there one moment and gone the next, swallowed by the black water before anyone could even shout. The Aztec operator sat strapped into his seat, headphones pressed to his ears, listening for the distinctive ping of a submarine's hull. In calm water, Aztec could detect a U-boat at 2,000 yards. In this chaos, he was lucky to hear anything beyond the roar of the waves. But he listened anyway, because that was his job, because men were depending on him, because somewhere out there German torpedoes waited. "Contact," he shouted suddenly. "Bearing 045, range uncertain." "It's faint, sir, could be biologics." "Biologics." Whales. The Aztec often picked up whale songs and mistook them for submarines. In training, operators learned to distinguish between them. In a storm, with static crackling and waves pounding, it was nearly impossible. Marsh appeared at his shoulder. "How certain are you?" The operator hesitated. 60%, sir. Maybe 70. 60%. In peacetime, no captain would attack on 60%. In peacetime, there was time for caution. Here, in the howling darkness, 60% might be the difference between saving a convoy and watching it burn. "Helm, come to 045. Engine room, I need everything you have." The destroyer heeled hard as she turned. Somewhere in the bowels of the ship, engineers who were already pushing their machinery to the limit found a little more. The old turbines screamed. The propellers bit into the churning water. HMS Dog surged forward into the teeth of the storm, chasing a ghost that might not even be real. Behind them, the convoy was already beginning to scatter. The merchantmen, unable to hold formation in the mountainous seas, were peeling off one by one, each captain fighting his own private war against the wind. By morning, they would be spread across 50 miles of ocean. By morning, if Marsh failed, the wolves would begin to feed. INU 447, the sonar operator suddenly sat upright. Her Kalu. Propeller noise. High-speed screws, bearing 220. Hoffman felt his blood turn to ice. That was impossible. No surface ship could operate in this weather. No surface ship would even try, but the sound was unmistakable. The fast, urgent beat of destroyer propellers, growing louder by the second, the British were hunting. And they were close. The depth charges fell like judgment from heaven. Hoffman heard them splash into the water above, heard the terrible seconds of silence as they sank, heard the click of the pressure triggers engaging. Then the world exploded. The first charge detonated 50 meters away. Close enough to hurt. Not close enough to kill. U-447 bucked and twisted as the shock wave slammed into her hull. Light bulbs shattered. Pipes burst. Men screamed. The emergency lighting flickered on, painting everything in bloody red. "Dive!" Hoffman shouted. "Take her down. 200 meters." The plainsman threw the controls forward. The submarine's nose dropped. They were running blind now, running deep, running from a hunter who should not have been there. Above them, they could hear the destroyer's propellers passing overhead, circling, searching. Hoffman knew the mathematics of survival. At 200 meters, the pressure was crushing. The hull could withstand it, barely. A near miss from a depth charge would crack them open like an egg. But staying shallow meant staying within the blast radius. There was no safe choice. There was only the choice that gave them the smallest chance of dying. On the surface, Marsh watched the water boil where his depth charges had detonated. No debris. No oil slick. The submarine had survived the first pattern. He had expected nothing less. U-boat commanders didn't survive long if they were easy to kill. Aztec, report. Contact lost, sir. She's gone deep. Below the layer. The thermocline. The boundary between warm surface water and cold deep water that bent sound waves and created blind spots. German commanders used it like a shield, diving beneath it to hide from British sonar. It worked. It worked often enough to be standard doctrine. Marsh refused to accept it. Signal to relentless. Take station 1,000 yards to our east. Box pattern. We'll drive him between us. For 3 hours, the hunt continued. The storm raged above while two destroyers prowled the surface, dropping depth charges at regular intervals, forcing the submarine to keep moving, keep evading, keep burning through her precious air supply. Below, Hoffman played every trick he knew. Silent running. Course changes. Decoys made from compressed air canisters. Nothing worked. The British stayed with him like wolves with a wounded deer. The air inside U-447 grew thick with carbon dioxide. Men gasped for breath. The carbon dioxide scrubbers, chemical systems designed to remove exhaled gas, couldn't keep up with 52 men breathing in terror. Headaches came first, then dizziness, then the strange euphoria that preceded unconsciousness. Hoffman watched his crew fading and knew he had to make a choice. "Chief, how long can we stay down?" The chief engineer's face was gray. "Another hour, maybe two. After that, we surface or we die down here." Surface. Into a force 10 storm. With a British destroyer directly overhead. It was suicide. But staying down was suffocation, slow and certain. At least on the surface, they had a chance to fight. Prepare to emergency surface. All hands to battle stations. The order passed through the boat like an electric shock. Men who had been slumped against bulkheads staggered to their feet. The gun crews gathered by the conning tower ladder. They knew what was coming. They knew most of them would not survive it. But they were German sailors, and they would die fighting. U-447 rose from the deep like a steel whale breaching. She burst through the surface in an explosion of foam and spray, her deck gun crew scrambling up the ladder before she had even leveled out. The storm hit them like a physical blow. Waves swept across the deck. Wind tore at their clothes. 2 men were washed overboard before they could reach their gun. Marsh saw the submarine surface 500 yards ahead. For a frozen moment, both vessels were balanced on the edge of an enormous wave, suspended in the gray void between sky and sea. Then Dog's guns opened fire, the 4-inch shells screamed across the water. In these conditions, accuracy was impossible. Most shots went wide, throwing up spouts of white water around the struggling submarine. But one shell struck the conning tower, tearing a hole in the steel, killing the men inside. Hoffman felt the impact. He was standing in the control room, watching his boat die. The deck gun never fired. The crew never had a chance. Another destroyer, Relentless, was closing from the east, her guns adding to the barrage. Trapped between them, U-447 could neither dive nor fight. "All hands abandon ship," Hoffman said quietly. "May God have mercy on us." The depth charges came in then, a full pattern that bracketed the submarine perfectly. The explosions lifted U-447 bodily from the water and broke her spine. She folded in the middle like a child's toy and began to slide beneath the waves, bow first, her propellers still spinning uselessly in the air. Men jumped from her deck into water that would kill them in minutes. Some died instantly in the explosions. Others drowned before they could swim clear. The lucky ones found debris to cling to, pieces of decking or empty shell casings, anything that would keep their heads above water. Marsh watched through his binoculars. He had won. The submarine was sinking. The convoy was safe. And somewhere in that black water, German sailors were dying, men just like his own crew, men who had families and fears and dreams that would never come true. "Lower the boats," he ordered. "Rescue operations. All survivors." Doyle looked at him with something like surprise. Rescuing enemy sailors in this storm was nearly as dangerous as fighting them. Men would risk their lives to save men who had been trying to kill them moments before. Marsh didn't explain. He didn't need to. They were sailors. The sea was their common enemy. Everything else was politics. The boats went over, and the rescue began. The coast of England emerged from the mist like a promise. Marsh stood on the bridge of HMS Dogged and watched the grey line grow, watched the familiar shapes of Liverpool's cranes and warehouses take form. They had been at sea for 72 hours. They had traveled nearly 800 miles through the worst weather the Atlantic could offer. They were alive, most of them, and they were home. Below decks, 11 German sailors huddled in the forward mess, wrapped in borrowed blankets, drinking tea laced with rum. They had been pulled from the freezing water by men who had every reason to hate them, men who had lost friends and brothers to German torpedoes. But hatred meant nothing in the face of the sea. When a man was drowning, you saved him. That was the law of sailors, older than any war. Captain Lieutenant Hoffman sat apart from his men. He had been given dry clothes and a private cabin, such courtesies as could be managed for an enemy officer. A British Marine stood guard outside his door, but the formality seemed pointless. Hoffman wasn't going anywhere. He was finished. 23 of his crew were dead, feeding the fishes in the North Atlantic. 3 years of war, 14 ships sunk, and it had come to this. A borrowed sweater and a cup of tea while his boat rusted on the ocean floor. Marsh came to see him as they entered the harbor. He didn't know why exactly. Perhaps he wanted to look into the face of the enemy. Perhaps he needed to confirm that Hoffman was human, was real, was not simply a shadow in the periscope. "You will be treated well," Marsh said stiffly. "The prisoner of war camps are not luxurious, but they are not cruel." Hoffman nodded. His English was good, learned in better days when Germany and Britain were not trying to destroy each other. "May I ask you a question, Commander?" "You may ask." "Why? Why did you sail into that storm?" "Any rational man would have waited." "We would have waited. Our orders were to wait." Marsh was silent for a long moment. Through the porthole, he could see the dock workers gathering, could hear the harbor coming alive with the sounds of their arrival. "Because waiting meant dying," he said finally. "Not for us. For the men in those cargo ships. For the people who needed what they carried. You risked everything. Your ship. Your crew. Your own life." "Yes." Hoffman smiled faintly. It was not a happy smile. "I admire you, Commander. And I fear what you represent. Men who will not stop. Men who will not calculate the cost. Men who simply refuse to lose." He paused. "Germany cannot defeat such men. I think I knew that before, but now I am certain." Marsh had no answer for that. He turned and left. On the deck, the crew assembled for arrival. They were exhausted, filthy, battered by the storm and the battle. 8 of their shipmates were dead, buried at sea with weights on their feet. 19 more were wounded, bandaged and splinted and waiting for proper medical care. The ship herself was a wreck, her hull buckled, her forward gun torn away, her engines barely functioning, but they stood straight. They stood proud. Because behind them, spread across the ocean, 42 merchant ships were reforming into convoy, every single one of them still afloat. Not one cargo had been lost. Not 1 ton of fuel or food or ammunition had gone to the bottom. The wolf pack had been broken. The lifeline had held. Doyle appeared at Marsh's shoulder, as he always did. "Signal from Admiralty, sir. Captain Whitmore sends his compliments. The convoy commodore has recommended you for decoration." Marsh crumpled the message without reading it. "Tell the men," he said. "They deserve the recognition. Not me. With respect, sir, the men already know what they did. What they need to know is that someone above decks appreciates it." Marsh looked at the old chief petty officer, this man who had served through 2 wars and survived when better men had died. Doyle had never steered him wrong. "Very well. Post it in the mess. Let them see." The harbor was full now, every ship sounding its horn in salute. The cacophony echoed off the warehouse walls and rolled across the gray water like thunder. Somewhere in that noise was gratitude, was recognition, was the simple human need to acknowledge courage when it appeared. Marsh tried to feel something. Pride, perhaps. Satisfaction. Relief. All he felt was tired. And beneath the tiredness, the old cold hatred that never quite went away. His brother was still dead. The U-boats were still out there. Tomorrow or the next day, another convoy would sail, and the whole bloody business would begin again. Sub-Lieutenant Peters climbed to the bridge, his face transformed. 3 weeks ago, he had been a frightened boy. Now he moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had been tested and not found wanting. "Sir, the pilot boat is approaching. We're cleared for berth 7. "Very well. Take us in, Peters." The young officer blinked. "Sir. You heard me. Take us in. You've earned it." Peters turned to the helm, his back straight, his orders clear and calm. Marsh watched him and allowed himself a moment of something almost like hope. The war would continue. The killing would continue. But there would always be men like Peters, men who learned courage instead of cruelty, men who could carry the burden when the older generation fell. HMS Dog slid into her berth with the delicacy of a dancer. Lines were thrown, secured, made fast. The gangway went down, and the wounded began their slow journey to the waiting ambulances. The German prisoners followed under guard, blinking in the weak English sunshine. Hoffman paused at the bottom of the gangway. He looked back at the destroyer that had killed his boat and saved his life. He caught Marsh's eye across the distance. Neither man waved. Neither man spoke. But something passed between them, some acknowledgement of shared humanity in the midst of inhuman war. Then Hoffman turned and walked into captivity, and Marsh turned back to his charts. The next convoy would sail in 48 hours. There was work to do.